We often think about corruption, you know, maybe it's just money changing hands under the table.
Yeah.
Simple.
Yeah, a basic transaction.
But what if I told you corruption might actually be fueling the kind of intense polarization we're seeing everywhere now? That's just one angle we're digging into today.
That's absolutely right. It's often much more insidious than just illicit profit. It can really eat away at the social fabric, often in ways you wouldn't expect.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds on corruption. Not just like the dictionary definition, but how we measure it, how people see it globally, and crucially, what's being done or what can be done about it.
And we're doing this by looking at a whole range of materials that you, our listener, provided. It's quite a mix.
It really is. We've got academic papers on corruption's effects, strategic planning tools like SWOT, deep dives into the Corruption Perceptions Index,
Yeah.
even practical guides for anti-corruption work.
So our job here is to kind of pull out the key threads from all these sources, connect the dots, and give you a clear picture.
We'll explore what these materials tell us about what corruption is, how we try to figure out how widespread it is, and, well, the strategies being cooked up to fight it.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe you start at the beginning. When we say corruption, what are we actually talking about here?
Well, the baseline definition that comes up across the sources is pretty consistent. The abuse of entrusted power for private gain.
Abuse of power for private gain.
Okay, but that's a broad umbrella. It covers a whole spectrum of activities, especially when you look at political corruption.
And yeah, the list provided in our sources is pretty extensive. It's not just bribery. We're talking abuse of power itself,
Yeah.
censorship, political repression, even violence.
Right. And then there's cronyism, election interference, which feels very relevant today, elite capture, influence peddling.
Insider trading, too.
Definitely. And it goes bigger systemically. Things like kleptocracy, essentially, a state run by thieves, or the idea of a mafia state. Then you have general misconduct terms like malfeasance, which is illegal conduct, and misfeasance, which is more like performing a legal act improperly.
Okay.
Plus nepotism favoring family state capture, where private interests basically dictate policy, state corporate crime, and, the classic slush funds.
That paints a really wide picture. You mentioned elite capture and those terms, malfeasance, misfeasance. Maybe just quickly clarify those.
Sure. Elite capture, it's basically when a small, powerful group heavily sways government decisions for their own benefits, sidelining everyone else. And malfeasance versus misfeasance, think of malfeasance as doing something flat out illegal, while misfeasance is doing something you're allowed to do, but doing it wrongly or improperly.
Got it. That helps. So it really shows corruption isn't just one thing. Now, one big way we try to measure this globally is the Corruption Perceptions Index, the CPI. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, the CPI, it's put out by Transparency International every year, started back in '95. Essentially, it ranks countries based on perceived levels of public sector corruption.
Perceived. Okay, that word seems key.
It is key. It's not counting actual bribes, PED, or court cases. It's based on the perceptions of experts and business executives, how corrupt they think a country's public sector is.
So it's a view from a particular vantage point. How does the scoring work? That 0 to 100 scale.
Right. It's 0 to 100. 0 means you're perceived as highly corrupt, and 100 means perceived as very clean, very low corruption.
Higher scores better.
Exactly. And to get that score, they take data from a bunch of different existing surveys and assessments. But these sources might use different scales, right? So first, they have to rescale everything to fit that standard 0-100 range.
Ah, okay. Like, if one survey scored corruption the other way around, they flip it?
Precisely. They standardize it. Then, for a country to get a score, they need data from at least 3 of these sources. They average those standardized scores together for the final CPI number.
3 sources minimum.
Okay. And they also report things like a standard error and a confidence interval. That gives you a sense of how much agreement or variation there is in the underlying source data for that country's score.
Right, so it shows this sort of statistical certainty or uncertainty around the score. Interesting. What about trends? Have we seen any big shifts lately in the CPI?
Well, there have been some notable changes. You see significant drops in places like Venezuela, which, given its political situation, maybe isn't shocking. But perhaps more interestingly, you also see declines in some established democracies. Sweden, the UK, their scores have dipped in recent years, according to the index.
That is interesting, not just authoritarian states.
Exactly. And on the flip side, some countries have shown a pretty significant improvement over the past decade or so. Places like Uzbekistan, Tanzania, Ukraine come up as examples of positive movers.
So movement in both directions, across different kinds of systems.
Yeah.
What about the overall picture, those regional averages for 2024?
Yeah, they give a broad snapshot. Western Europe and the EU come out on top, average score around 64.
Highest perceived integrity.
Right. Then you have the Americas around 42, Asia Pacific around 44, Central Asia and Eastern Europe lower at about 35. The Middle East and North Africa averaged 39. Sub-Saharan Africa had the lowest regional average, about 32.5.
And the world average.
The global average was about 42.6 in 2024. So it gives you a sense of the landscape, but again, based on those perceptions.
Okay, perception is the key word. And our sources definitely highlighted some criticisms or limitations of the CPI. What should we keep in mind?
Absolutely. It's not a perfect tool. The biggest critique, as we've said, is that it measures perceptions. And the worry there is that perceptions can sometimes lag behind reality or even reinforce stereotypes about certain places rather than reflecting, the actual facts on the ground.
Right, stereotypes can be sticky.
They can. Another major point is the focus. It's primarily public sector corruption. Big scandals in the private sector, think LIBOR manipulation or the VW emissions cheating, that kind of corporate corruption, isn't what the CPI is designed to capture.
That seems like a pretty significant blind spot, doesn't it?
It definitely is, depending on what you're trying to understand. Also, the people surveyed are experts and business leaders. Their view might be quite different from the experience of an ordinary citizen dealing with, say, petty bribery for basic services.
Yeah, the everyday impact might be missed.
Could be. And finally, a really important caution. Don't read too much into small year-to-year changes in a country's score, especially if you're trying to judge if an anti-corruption reform worked.
Why is that?
Well, several reasons. There's always a margin of error in these kinds of stats. Perceptions themselves often change slowly, maybe slower than actual conditions. And perceptions can be swayed by things other than just the level of corruption, like media coverage or political events. So a sustained trend over several years might tell you something, but a one-point jump. Probably not definitive evidence of reform success.
Okay, so use it as a guide, a snapshot, but be aware of what it isn't measuring and the nuances. Good point. Now, earlier you mentioned these surprising far-reaching effects. One was this link between corruption and societal polarization. How does that work?
Yeah, this is fascinating and quite worrying. The sources suggest that when corruption, especially big stuff like state capture, where powerful groups essentially control policy for their benefit, becomes really ingrained, it can create or deepen these societal divides. You end up with basically two camps. Those who benefit from the corrupt system, maybe through patronage or dodgy deals, and those who are shut out, disadvantaged, and maybe angry about it.
So it creates these opposing tribes almost.
Exactly. And once those lines are drawn, it becomes harder to find common ground, to compromise, even to have a rational debate about policy.
Because it's not about the policy anymore.
It can become less about the actual merits of an idea or even traditional left-right ideology, and more about who's proposing it. Is it our side or their side? Which network stands to benefit? It poisons the well of public discourse.
That really highlights how corruption isn't just about stolen money. It can fundamentally damage how a society functions. Okay, so if it's this complex, how do we even start analyzing it and planning ways to fight back? The sources mention specific tools like SWOT.
Right. When you're facing a complex problem like corruption, structured analysis helps. SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats is one tool mentioned. It's a way to gather and organize different viewpoints.
I know SWOT from business strategy. How does it apply here?
Pretty similarly, actually. You get relevant people together, maybe anti-corruption activists, government officials, researchers, and brainstorm. What are the strengths of current anti-corruption efforts? What are their weaknesses or vulnerabilities? What opportunities exist in the environment, maybe political will or new technology? And what threats could derail progress, perhaps powerful opposition or economic instability?
So you map out the landscape.
Exactly. You record all these points, categorize them. Maybe you brainstorm freely first, then sort, or focus on the most critical ones. The aim is a shared understanding of the internal capabilities and the external factors you're dealing with.
Sounds useful for anyone on the same page. What about PESTLE analysis? Another acronym.
PESTLE is another strategic tool, but it focuses specifically on the external macro environment. It stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors.
So broadening the lens beyond the immediate situation.
Precisely. It prompts you to think systematically about the bigger picture. What's the political climate? Stability, rule of law, political corruption levels, economic factors, growth, poverty, inequality, illicit finance, social trends, norms around corruption, public awareness, civil society's role,
Okay.
technological aspects. How is tech enabling or fighting corruption like e-governance or surveillance?
Mm.
Legal framework. Are anti-corruption laws strong? Enforced? Is the judiciary independent? And environmental factors sometimes overlooked, but think about natural resource management where corruption can be rife.
And how does PESTLE connect back to SWOT?
Often, the factors you identify using PESTLE, these big external forces, can be classified as either opportunities or threats in your SWOT analysis. PESTLE helps you systematically scan that external horizon.
Ah, I see. So PESTLE feeds into the O and T of SWOT. When would you typically use PESTLE?
It's especially helpful when, say, launching a new anti-corruption program or maybe moving into a new area where corruption dynamics might differ, or just as part of regular strategic planning to make sure you're aware of the shifting context.
Makes sense.
The process usually involves brainstorming these external issues, thinking about their implications, rating how important or likely they are, and considering what you'd do if they actually happened.
It's about being prepared for those outside influences. Now, advocacy also came up as really important. How does that fit in?
Advocacy is critical. It's framed in the sources as this strategic and constructive engagement with stakeholders. The goal isn't just to complain, but to promote real change in policies, in practices, even in attitudes to ultimately end corruption.
So it's proactive, aimed at specific changes.
Exactly. A good advocacy campaign needs a solid plan. It requires really understanding the problem, having a clear vision for the solution, and figuring out how to influence the people or institutions who can actually make that change happen.
And there's a process for planning that.
Yes, the sources outline steps. First, really analyze the specific corruption problem you're targeting and identify everyone with a stake in it, the stakeholders.
Okay.
Then, define the building blocks of your plan. What are your specific, measurable objectives? What solutions or policy changes are you pushing for? Next, you have to assess the risks. Advocacy can be risky, and check if your plan is actually feasible and sustainable.
Right.
Then, you link your planned activities to the resources you need, money, people, time. And crucially, you need a system for monitoring and evaluation. Are you actually making progress so you can learn and adjust?
That sounds quite thorough. You mentioned analyzing the problem. Any specific tools for that?
Yeah, a couple were highlighted. One is called Pick a Winning Issue. It's a way to prioritize. You look at different potential issues, maybe corruption in procurement versus bribery in schools, and rate them based on how important is this? Does tackling it align with our values? And critically, is it actually winnable? Can we realistically achieve change here?
So you focus your limited resources effectively.
Exactly. Another tool is the problem tree. This is more visual. You map out the causes and effects related to a central corruption problem. What are the root causes underneath? What are the consequences branching out? It helps you see the connections and maybe identify the most strategic point to intervene.
Like finding the trunk of the tree, not just trimming the leaves.
That's a good analogy. And once you have that problem tree, you can flip it into an objective tree. You basically rephrase each problem as a positive goal. So lack of transparency becomes increased transparency. It helps turn your problem analysis into concrete objectives for your advocacy.
Shifting from problem-focused to solution-focused. Smart. You also mentioned stakeholder analysis. Who are they and why analyze them?
Stakeholders are basically anyone affected by the issue or anyone who can influence the outcome. Governments, businesses, NGOs, media, international bodies, the public, could be a long list.
Right.
Analyzing them means figuring out who are they? What's their stance on the issue? Are they allies, opponents, or neutral? How much do they care? And importantly, how much influence do they have on decisions?
And knowing that helps you tailor your strategy.
Absolutely. You don't engage with a strong ally the same way you engage with a powerful opponent, right? Maybe you mobilize allies, try to persuade the neutrals, and perhaps find ways to mitigate the influence of opponents. It's about understanding the power dynamics and navigating them strategically.
It's like mapping the political terrain.
Yeah.
Okay, and how do you make sure your advocacy activities actually connect to the change you want?
There's a useful exercise called the So That chain. For every activity you plan, say, run a workshop, you ask, we run the workshop so that what happens next? Maybe. So that participants understand the issue better. Then you ask again, they understand it better so that, maybe, so that they support our proposed policy change.
Oh.
You keep going, linking the immediate result of the activity to your broader purpose and ultimately to your overall aim of reducing corruption. It forces you to check the logic. Does this activity really contribute to the goal?
It ensures there's a clear pathway from action to impact. And monitoring and evaluation, you stress that. Why is it so vital?
Because without it, you're flying blind. You need to track if your efforts are working. This means setting clear indicators what will success look like, figuring out where you'll get the information to measure those indicators, and finding ways to collect and analyze that data. It should be simple, cost-effective, maybe involve the people you're working with.
And it lets you adapt if things aren't working.
Exactly. Adapt, learn, and demonstrate your impact. But, again, the sources warn, don't just rely on something like the CPI score changing year on year as your only measure of success. It's too blunt an instrument for evaluating specific advocacy work.
Right. Need more specific measures tied to your actual activities. Got it.
Yeah.
Beyond these tools, are there bigger international frameworks guiding this fight?
Yes, definitely. The big one is the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC. It's a major international treaty that sets out standards and requirements for countries to prevent and criminalize corruption. And the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, is a key player here. They help countries implement UNCC, providing practical guides and assistance for developing national anti-corruption strategies.
So there's global cooperation and support structures. What makes a national anti-corruption policy effective, according to the sources?
Several key things came up. One is having clear responsibility, often assigned to a specific, maybe semi-independent body. Crucially, you need real, sustained political support from the very top.
Leadership buy-in.
Absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Regular consultations with different government agencies and stakeholders are also important for coordination and buy-in. Good collaboration between the body overseeing the strategy and the agencies actually doing the work on the ground is key.
Makes sense.
Also mentioned was leveraging reputation, setting clear timelines for evaluation, and being transparent about progress. And finally, making sure these anti-corruption bodies actually have the authority and the resources they need to do their jobs without it being easily interfered with.
So it's a mix of structure, leadership, collaboration, transparency, and real power to act.
That sums it up well.
Wow. Okay, this has been incredibly insightful, a real deep dive, true to form. So just to recap, corruption is way more than just bribes. It can actually fuel divisions in society. The CPI gives us a useful, if limited, snapshot of perceptions of public sector corruption. But we need to be aware of those limitations.
Crucially.
And tools like SWOT and PESTLE, plus really structured advocacy planning, give us frameworks to analyze the problem and actually develop effective strategies to fight back.
That's a great summary. Hopefully going through all these different sources you provided has given you, our listener, a much clearer picture of just how complex corruption is, but also the range of tools and approaches being used to tackle it.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given how hard it is to measure corruption directly and the limits of perception indices like the CPI, how can we develop better, maybe more direct or innovative ways to track the real, tangible impact of corruption on people's everyday lives and on society as a whole? That feels like a really important question moving forward, doesn't it?
It really does. Something to keep thinking about.
Definitely. Well, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.